on the show, the opening. I started the opening before I clicked the go, and by the time it gets going, most of the message is gone. So, oh well, such is life. The awkwardness of bouncing from one effing window to another with the stupid screens that I have to bounce back and forth on. I'm terrible at this. These are old 1950s hands. These are not used to all this newfangled crap. So I totally apologize for the pathetic nature of my work here. Now let's see. Let's all then get our patrons, without whom things would be much tougher than they are. And I thank everybody on there, our colleagues, Hendrel, Eric, and Suris, our researchers, Barbara, Ian, Convert Me, Stephen Early, James Fitzwater, History Minor, Ologia, Ralph and Benjamin and Slava and Speed of Sound, Studio, DM Wing, Command, Cyborg, Daronco, Scott Duke, Christopher, Lavender Lady, Antoine, Marigale, My Finished on Journey, Nana, Morton Nielsen, Bo, Alex, Paul, and all of our legacy patrons who helped along the way. So there's our reminder of everybody who has helped make things the way they are. So it's hot here in Spokane. It's going to be a little cooler during the week, going down to the 80s, and then it's going to be back up into the 90s by the weekend. So we're kind of running amok all up and down in here. But I will allude to part 2 of the show that will be on good old Michael Oard and ooids, which you may not be known about. I wasn't terribly familiar with them. They're little teeny grains of sand, which Oard is insisting is stuff from the flood. But the main is the saying goodbye-bye to Nathaniel Jensen's, "Hi, Gregory. Freezing cold Johannesburg. Rumors of snow." Well, it is winter down there. Unfortunately, I've not even gotten in the range of Johannesburg in my Paralogs of Fog story, number 2 over there, which has some stuff set in South Africa. But Johannesburg did not exist in 1878 when they're schlepping down there. My characters in that novel passed through Pretoria, which was kind of like a miscellaneous tent city and a little military garrison down there. And it was pretty inconsequential. But Johannesburg, I think, didn't come along until the 1920s. So if Gregory, you get Paralogs of Phileas Fogg 2, you can send me messages to tell me whether I'm getting Australia or South Africa right. I have a big bit of it set up in Lake Fundudzi, that kind of sacred lake. That's, I think, a national park up in there. There's no settlements or anything there to this day. Formed as a miners' market in 1886. Okay. So it would have been still pretty inconsequential at that time. My characters, I'm silly digression here because I've got somebody in here that actually knows about South Africa. My characters come in Port Elizabeth in the south, and they schlep over to take the train, which was brand new at the time, that went up to connect up to the gold mines up in Kimberley. And then they have to find their way farther northeast to get to their actual destination, which they decide to go by the river, the Vaal. And I did hopefully not too bad of research on the idea that there could have been, there were various portages and things across the Vaal, and occasional little steamer runs and things. There's rapids in various spots on the river that I understand, but fortunately, hopefully, not in the area that they would actually have traveled on. And then they go by a hired wagon north through Pretoria and the ruins of stuff that was left over from the old Boer settlements, and then finally up to this imaginary plantation that I have set up there on nearby Lake Fundudzi, where things ensue with the mystery airship that has come there for a visit. So therein lays the hangle. 2 years before Darwin published his book, yes, okay, so I was listening to Evolution of the Fossils and Why They Matter on Audible, learned about this creation as pre-Darwin, who started the God, created everything, so it looks like there was the Omphalos argument. It goes back, there's various ways. I think the guy is in the 19th century that came up with that argument that everything was created with apparent age, and it was quite popular in young earth creationism in the 60s and 70s era. It's kind of fallen a bit out of favor as that idea, But creationists really do require things to be fully formed when they're made. Yes. Oh, yeah. The new name is an unpronounceable thing, traditional name with a slick sound. Yeah, there's an awful lot. In the same way that we've been gradually renaming a lot of our mountains here in the United States to their original name. So Mount Whitney, out in Alaska. Mount Denali, in. And then some of the ones, Indian names in my neck of the woods are almost calculated to be easily mispronounced by people outside of the area. So, when people talk about, Coeur d'Alene, that's kind of a French sounding thing. So a lot of them are transliterations of other things, but that's true of almost everybody, every culture. Nobody in Nippon says Japan. Nobody in Munich says Munich. It's Asian. Everybody has kind of stolen everybody else's names, and whoever makes the dictionaries and does the catalogings and all that. And then, of course, you have the political things of where Germans and Russians would be back and forth as to what the names were for Polish cities as one controlled them, and they would change the labels. In fact, there's a scene in Paralogs 2 about a visit to Alsace for reasons to take a look at what Passepartout has squirreled away in that silver mine. Anyway, when he arrived on our little planet, it was French. And when they go visiting it in 1876, it's German. And so they're relabeling all the signs in German and changing to the German currency and all of that. And there's a little bit of resentment on that point, which, of course, is going to lead to all sorts of messes as the thing ping-pongs back and forth in World War I and afterwards. So anyway, a slight digression. So the main point that I was trying to get up was the fact that we are done with Nathaniel Jensen. If regular viewers of the show will have noticed how I was constantly reminding everybody how few sources were being cited in this book, and why I was expecting when he gets to the appendices or somewhere, it's going to be like a tidal wave. Indians are fake Indians. Yeah. Scuss with the Indian I had dinner with Friday. She's actual Indian descent. Well, we've got huge blocks of people who you might not visually immediately identify as Indian, air quotes. And of course, a lot of the tribal identifications here in the United States can drop in percentage points. And of course, it was all the kerfuffle about Elizabeth Warren a few years back. A lot of families would like to claim Indian ancestry. And in the old spiritualist movement in the 19th century, there were probably an absolute glut of Indian princesses and Egyptian queens and all of this stuff that showed up as spirit mediums. So anyway, hi, Purple. Anyway, I'm rambling all the way around the topic, which is we're saying bye-bye to Nathaniel Jensen's Trace this week. And when I was looking at my expectations for the reference list, there were an awful lot of technical sources and quite a lot of general sources that I was waiting for him to cite. And I was expecting maybe that he might goof up here and there. I'd already detected 3 sources, one of which was mentioned in his text, but which he forgot to put in the bibliography, this old work from 1857 by Livingstone, which was drawn off the internet, and he didn't put a reference in to it in the reference bibliography. And then there was a creationist thing from Snelling that he forgot to put in the references. And then this other paper that he alludes to in the picture credit area from Savalev and Robitz, a 2020 paper that he apparently decided not to put in the reference list because he got tired or something, I don't know. But when I finally got down to the end of it, I'm going, oh my, there's an awful lot he didn't cite. As in an awful lot, 63% of his sources he never cites in the book. And 61% of the general works are never cited. But my jaw dropped when I did a count, and there's 78% of his technical sources he never bothers to cite. What? That's 92 out of his 100 some odd. That's almost all of his technical references aren't being cited. So they're pretty much following the same boundary layer as other creationists, where the majority of them are overlooking data. And had he gone to the rigmarole of doing that, I think it's very possible that he could be accused of misstepping around even more evidence than I documented for the last few weeks. But the thing was for me to wonder how he got into that muck. And there are several examples in his bibliography where things are out of alphabetical order. And at least one example, I'll be putting a link up to it, where he gets the name of the journal wrong. He somehow thinks that there's a Nature review, a BMC Genetics or something, which is not a thing. But so he gives it the wrong journal name and that. So my suspicion is that he did actually draw on most all of the sources that are in there. Slight digression. Yep, it's the evolution hour we know so well. Yeah. The advantages of that improved internet. Wow, I'm glad that we finally got that better connection that I can connect. This is connected up by the Ethernet, so it's don't have to go that route. That the service that I needed to be able to upgrade like this wasn't available where I happen to live in my district of Spokane for a year or two. And finally, they expanded their thing out, and I was able to glom onto it. So yay, it's so much nicer. Anyway, I suspect what Jensen did was compile this reference bibliography kind of on the fly while he was doing his other thing. And he was not terribly attentive to noting a lot of the reference notes. Remember, one of the books that he came up with, he kept on listing it as 1975 when it came out in 1978. So he just gets stuck in a rut on things. And by the time he got down to the end of it, he kind of figured, well, they're fine and dandy. I've got it nicely. And he alluded to things specifically along the way. But it never dawned on him that as a rigorous scholar, you would need to match up to make sure that everything that's in the bibliography is cited in the text, and everything that's cited in the text is in the bibliography. That's what it's for. So, yes, and I can stream more than 5 minutes at a time. Hopefully, Lamont, I'll be able to pop in, and I'll probably use this laptop because it's an easier connection, I suspect, for our discussions of source methods on the 15th, which I think will be potentially interesting. It's not a rocket science topic, or at least it shouldn't be. It can be a boring topic because nothing is more exciting than going through footnotes and the like. But the principles involved are bare bones basic scholarship. Absolutely everybody can do it. And so it's not something that requires hyper specialized skill other than being careful. And in the age of the internet, knowing the right tools and that to be able to use, my gosh, you can find out a hell of a lot. I mean, as I've shown in the books and things that I've been doing, it's amazing what you can find available, full text, original material, which is what you need to be able to source check people. You got to be able to get to the primary source. Anyway, these are the only sources he mentioned in the text but doesn't give, or they're the ones you recognize as no. He structured the reference bibliography in a perfectly normal way. It wasn't paying. He had quite a lot of internet listings that he would just have in the notes, and he didn't really pay any attention to listing those as an addendum in the bibliography. So they were all either books and a huge swath of general books on the subject, where he was getting little anecdotal nibblets about the Maya and Iranians and a whole bunch of different ones, of which the vast majority of them he never ended up mentioning. He didn't even mention Osterreicher, 1995, which was a scathing criticism. I think it was a PhD or master's dissertation, can't remember which, on this Wallam Olam book, a hoax, and including criticism of the guy who had written a new translation of this text. That's very probably just pulling out his ass. And I noted earlier that Jensen buys into this guy. He's okay with it because he has talked himself into thinking that the Wallam Olam chronology, and it refers to the flood and things, fits his truncated chronology. Never mind that the guy who brought the Wallam Olam to the world and probably forged it back in the 19th century also thought Atlantis was involved in the matter. And so there's a whole bunch of stuff which Jensen may not be terribly aware of, in the same way that he didn't get around to putting in it. So So everything is perfectly legitimate technical sources. I haven't found any example of his sources that are not real. Once in a while, he uses idiosyncratic ways of listing them, and an occasional typo here and there, puts the wrong little declension mark on the O in a little case, which is very easy to do. I can do that. So that I don't fault him for. But it's just wondering how he managed to have such a disconnect. I've never seen a work that where you go to the trouble of putting sources in that you ever use. Now, I'm not willing to accuse him of being a Scott Hughes. Scott Hughes was a young Earth creationist. No, he's still around, so he is a young Earth creationist, who was a source vacuum guy. He would glom on other people's sources as if they were his own, and because he was an incompetent boob, he ended up not even using them all in his book. He was clearly cribbing from other people, including Luther Sunderland, the wacky 1980s creationist. And the reason why I could verify exactly where he got this crap from, I think I alluded to it in one of the segments of the old tip postings, or 3 macroevolutionary episodes, I think, all of which is available on my website. You download all that stuff. You can make use of all of that. That's why it's there. Anyway, that he, the reason I knew he was cribbing stuff from Sunderland is because there was a particular source in there on mammals, and Hughes doesn't discuss any of that. Not only that, it was written in a very specific description of the text, the footnote, which exactly matched Sunderland, and Sunderland had the thing wrong. I think he had the date wrong or something, but it was an inaccurate citation. That there was an original source that Sunderland was riffing off of, but he got the data wrong. And clearly, the only place that Hughes could have gotten that mistake was riffing off of Sunderland, copying it down, padding out his reference list. I don't think Jensen was padding. It was interesting that there's virtually no overlap between the material that's in this book and the previous Replacing Darwin. So he didn't, if he wanted to just pad, he could have pulled in all that crap that he had, which is quite a big bibliography, and which everything was cited. I don't think I spotted any examples of where he had a mismatch, but of course he didn't have a reference bibliography in that book too. So, but anyway, a compilation of all the sources he uses, at least is complete, and it's much bigger than what we see here. So he was ending up with a much smaller reference bibliography that was fresh material, that wasn't stuff he was culling from his original stuff. And I think he just got lazy and inattentive. And that although there was a couple examples of some really obscure things, that I'm wondering where he was planning on using them. One about the grains that were picked up in a Chinese study of Zhou Dynasty fortress, which is, in the period, I think, pre-Christian, but way after the flood and that. And I don't know where the hell he planned on using that. Unfortunately, the copy of the text I have of his, I can't do text search. It's a PDF format, but it doesn't allow searching in it. And so you got to go through manually to find out what the hell's going on stuff. But I'm charitable, and I'm willing to give him the mention of the doubt that he was just being vague and sloppy. And given the amount of information that all of the sources that he did cite versus also the ones he didn't, oh my gosh, he would have had to have done a way more work to even try to tackle all of the implications of him pulling that genetic history down post-flood, which is what he was doing in the book. And that meant that everything connected to it, especially in all that Neolithic stuff and early cultural stages in China, in Egypt, there were so many examples of items that are showing up in volume 2 of The Rocks Were There, that there's going to be quite a few little bits where I'm going, this was mentioned by, this was in Jensen's bibliography, but he never cited it. So we would know, in principle, he could have known about that information, but doesn't allude to it. So he's falling behind Robert Carter, who has been a critic of Jensen, by the way, on this very book. So it's a not showing up extremely well for him. One of the things he overlooks that is particularly hilarious is the radiocarbon calibrations for ancient Egypt, because Egypt is a big problem for the whole big slosh scenario, because the dogma in young Earth creationism requires all of it to be post-flood. Not just pyramids, although those are the big ticket items that tend to get the focus of the little gang at Answers in Genesis, and ICR and a few other places. But the pre-dynastic range also, in principle, has to be pulled down as well. And although you've got creationists, so there's a couple of them in there, we'll be alluding to them in the book, that are trying this little recalibration trick. It's very superficial and arbitrary, in the same way that Velikovsky was back in the 1960s and 70s, trying to rearrange the Egyptian chronology to fit his Venus flyby catastrophism and all that. They tend to know that China's written records going back 10,000. Well, I think the very earliest records are very proto-languagey. The really full-blown stuff does date considerably after that. Although there's another matter that's going to be coming up in the book, which is the supposed Chinese reflections of Genesis. There's a little block of some Chinese creationists and their American and European counterparts who have glommed onto them, who are insisting that the ideograms of some of the things in Chinese writing are direct cribs from the Bible story. Yeah. And this pops up most hilariously in their attempt to show that flood glyph actually is 8 men on a boat, 8 people on a boat images, which requires them doing just some hilarious misreads of the way the hieroglyph, the pictograms are put together and how they're used in the dynamics of things. And there's been a whole bunch of stuff on that, and particularly the use of the number 8. And if anything, it reminds me of the whole dynamic of occultism and numerology and that bit. You find that same obsession operating, except in a creationist mindset. Anyway, this is going to be in a section, will be an appendix in the book on the various flood stories around the world, although not absolutely comprehensive, because there's an awful lot of repetition to a lot of them. We're going to be hitting the major points and the Wallam Olam matter and Jensen screw up and the Crazy Eights Chinese flood stuff. That pretty much these things bump into the lower basement of modern day creationism. So it was really revealing that Jensen was buying into this thing when even his fellow creationists are kind of leery of the Wallam Olam thing. They skirted around it. Anyway, so off to part 2, our exciting little ooids. And remember, then next week, we are going to be commencing with Titans of the Earth, Sea, and Air by Jonathan Sarfati and Joel Tay. A not ridiculously thick book, glossy pictures and all the rest. It's got footnote references, but no conventional reference bibliography. So I think I want to compile one and to find out just what's in it. And okay, yes, Lamont, that's what the whole video is for. You can come back to it later. How long that will take, we'll find out. What I'll be looking on there is to see how much of the dinosaur paleontology that we know of, because this is a recent book, it's only out in the last year or two, how much of the dinosaur paleontology is anything remotely up to date, and how much of it is channeling material that's been presented by other apologists, both young Earth creationists, and I think they can riff off of some of the intelligent design thing. Certainly in relation to the bird-dinosaur connection, my jaw would drop if they weren't waving Alan Fiducia. So those are the kind of things I'll be anticipating, and to cross-check to see, to compile just exactly how many sources are in this little thing, which is aimed at a fairly technically astute creationist audience. This isn't a book for kids. It's a little bit above that level. So we'll be finding out. And Jonathan Sarfati is a monumental manipulator, along with Jerry Bergman and a few others who have had really long careers in creationism. I mean, they've been gone back decades. They're probably more desiccated than I am if they were ever to bump in, but they tend to show pictures of somebody much younger than their current selves, whereas I just go with who am I? I am, look like this, devil take the hindmost. I have no vanity whatsoever. When you look at this, you realize why bother? So the other part of this relates to good old Michael Oard and his bloody ooids. It's not a terribly long thing, and I'll be putting the posting up as to the linkage on that, and everybody can follow up. And I've got as much as I could acquire open access and some more stuff besides as to what he was dealing in. And you got to give Oard credit for riffing off current material. There's a small body of creationists that are obsessive about that. Brian Thomas is their point guy on a lot of this over in Young Earth Creationism. To some extent, Tim Clary is. They've lost some of the sidebar people who might have done this, like in geology with John Morris, who died just this year. And so they're no longer going to be publishing much, although that hasn't stopped ICR from trotting out old Henry Morris posts going back decades. They're on like a Rolodex that keep on getting linked to over the years, even though he died almost 20 years ago. Ooids are these cute little rocks, and Oard is just absolutely convinced that they are flood evidence. And he cites some recent papers on the subject, some of which are not available open access, but one of them was, Trower 2018, which I'll be putting a link to. But of course, what you're not getting is the context of anything. And so there's a bunch of literature that isn't being cited by Oard. That's yet another reminder of one of the things you watch out for when you're dealing with ideologues is the deck stacking. It's not that they don't have sources. You think anyone under 40 knows what a Rolodex is? Probably not. A Rolodex looks like a little spinny thing that has little cards attached on it that you can wheel it around. Boop, 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 boop. And if you spun it really fast, it would work like a little inefficient fan. And this would have information. These were common in the secretaries in offices of big businesses and colleges and all the rest. So you would have your listing of all of your little people on them instead of being in a file that would be, or in your address list on your smartphone. These were landline things, and you had to have a repository for the information to know what you were dealing with. And in principle, so the Rolodex image is one that you would have your happy little information bit rather than the names of people you were going to call, but your go-to tropes on a Rolodex that you could just spin around and go, aha, there we go. Boop, boop, boop. So now I've explained it for the youngins. Are you happy, Purple? I suppose I'm going to have to explain next what phone booths are, and what cars before they had FM stereo radios, and indeed explain a television set that's not thin, and all of that stuff, like having hard copy backups with. Well, let me give a plug for hard copy backups. It's not so bad dealing with science papers, typically, although you can store it as a PDF and that sort of thing. But internet material, I have done many a time where I have backlog material that I have taken off the internet and printed it out as a file. More recently, I have a tendency to save them as doc files, so I save them electronically. But the main point is that internet stuff can often disappear. And especially if you're an information distortion crowd like creationists or political ideologues, they like tidying up themselves by removing the paper trail. Still some public phones. I think there may, and in public buildings and things, there still are some. And of course, businesses and that still have internal landlines and all the rest, in addition to all the little smartphones they have as personal telephones. So they're not entirely extinct. And of course, people watching old movies will see people using telephones and typewriters and all the other ancient instruments of our era. But what the hell can we do? Anyway, I noticed in Evolution Slam Dunk was a major example of seeing the forensic information that comes from having a hard copy of something that's no longer on the internet. So I was able to determine that a current posting at CMI, which is anonymous on the reptile mammal transition, was actually written by a particular guy. It's not Chadwick, it's Cheswell. I've forgotten his name right off the bat. Starts with a C. Anyway, the only reason why I could make those dots connected is because I had an earlier version of that. I think the official posting is like 2013, maybe somewhere around there. But there was a 2008-ish version that I had printed out as a hard copy, and it was a rough draft of this argument, and it was named as to who wrote it. He's one of the editors there at CMI. So, I mean, he's or Creation Wiki. I mean, I remember the organization he was coming up with. Anyway, the more recent version of it is still available, accessible, but the earlier version's gone with the wind. And not only could I see how he had modified his argument over years to kind of resolve problems that he was digging himself while he dug up new holes to fall into, there was also the fact that you could see what information that he was adding in or leaving out versus the two versions. And you wouldn't be able to know that if you didn't have that hard copy. So there is an advantage to having that. Reminder to give your donations to the Wayback Machine. Yes, there's an awful lot that's on that. There are archival material that's going on. I'll be having a lot of that discussion with Lamont on that scholarly methods issue, that I, as a scholar, am so gobsmacked by how much material is available nowadays online. And although not every is available, and there was, in fact, that little secret back door of a lot of book postings that were available for a while, including my book, by the way. So I could have griped on copyright infringement, but I didn't mind because so much else was available. But apparently, a few months back, the federal government shut it down. So, bye-bye. But we all know that from a scholar's point of view, that the ability to glom on the material without having to pay for it, if you have limited finances, can't afford to buy stuff all the time, it's important. And if you're doing direct source analysis, you got to be able to see the original material. So a lot of very older books are available, which surprised me. Again, we had the section in Roxford there where there was this 1890s book on homology issues and vestigial organs that was blatantly misrepresented by Carl Wieland, as it turned out. And we found that out when we saw the original texts and discovered that none of the claims he was making about this Wiedersheim book were accurate. Wiedersheim was doing a really good job in the 1890s, given the material, and Wieland was directly misrepresenting his content. So, great site that had PDFs of lots of out-of-print books available that got shut down. Yeah, that can all happen. So that's another point, that if you find a gold mine like that, use it. I made a point of downloading as many works as I could, freebie from them. And so an awful lot of stuff I was able to glom onto. And then there are other people that trade material. It's how I got the Jensen book. There was somebody, Dan Stern Cardinale, happened to have a PDF of it. And so I was able to get it that way. Because anybody that's attempting to do this stuff, you got to have the primary sources. Kids So Sure could modify the tape rewinding sports car to be the world's fastest race car. That's so bad. Yeah. I remember the joys of finally getting to put a cassette player in the car. This would have been in the 1970s, early 80s period. And then the next vehicles that came along started having cassette players built in. And then later on, you had the CD. So you would have a cassette player and a CD player. And then they finally abandoned the cassette player. And I never did have an 8-track player, although my brother had an 8-track player in his car. This, of course, is so much more convenient than the attempts that Chrysler did in the 1950s and all the way down into the 60s. I think they were still dangling with the idea of putting a record player in a car. I'm afraid the Skippy problem is just not working out on that. Anyway, we're dangling away from ooids. So you're going to see a 2018 paper on that, and a further context from 2018. There's one from Nature, Sipos, on the shape evolution of ooids, and another one from 2018, Bachelor, which is a paper that's directly building on Trower 2017, which is one of the papers that I won't be able to put a link up to because it's not open access, on the role of biofilms in the production of these little ooids. So what it's Ord's only allusion to the biofilm side of it was a side swipe. I'll be putting the quote up in the main text on the video. Microorganisms did not aid growth, as some mechanisms postulate, but in fact were destructive. Bum, bum, bum. Citing the Trower papers. But the 2017 experiments of Trower were, quote, were not designed to explicitly test the hypothesis that ooid growth can be promoted by microbial biofilms, but instead to determine whether ooids can grow during active transport, and if so, at what rate. In other words, they worried about the topic there. I'm pretty sure it was Chryslers that were doing them. I can't remember whether they were just only in the upper level Chryslers and maybe in the Chrysler Imperials. And I seem to think they were mainly like 1956-ish, somewhere around in that thing. The problem with the record player in a car was the same problem the early CD players had, is that bumping along, the laser or needle, worse, could skip. And what made the CD player practical for cars is when they developed a memory buffer. So you're not hearing the CD live. The laser can read the text, and if it bumps a little, it can go back to where it left off and pick up the information again and compile it all, lickety-split fast, because we're talking about computers, and dump it downstream to go into the memory buffer. So you're getting processed signal instead of trying to read the CD directly and in real time. And all that was kind of fun. I never saw when they did them in the early 1960s. Yeah, I'm sure there's probably a post on Wikipedia on that kind of a thing. It was an amazingly bad idea. And of course, this was also at a time, if you're in the 1950s, then this would have been non-stereo records. The records would have been thicker. And they would have been purely mono. There was a big revolution that was coming in the mid to late 1950s and into the 1960s. I still remember in the 60s there were records that would say that they could only be played on a stereophonic record player because the needles required to play them. If you put a heavier old style needle on them for the old style things, it could damage the disc. And then some of them would advertise they could be played on both a mono arrangement and the new stereo players. And of course, later on, there was even the attempt to do quadraphonic, which lasted about 5 minutes. As I recall, that was like in the 70s or 80s, somewhere around in there. A lot of that just became irrelevant when you moved into the digital era and you had different ways of doing stuff. So anyway, all of you youngins, if there are any of you watching the show, these are the memories of old people talking about an ancient time, of the time of your parents or perhaps even grandparents, a time when gasoline was under $1 and cars could be bought, luxury cars, for only $3,000 or $4,000. But then again, your wages were much lower and the quality of the machines were terrible and all the rest. I wouldn't want to trade my Honda hybrid with its anti-lock brakes and temperature control air conditioning and collision avoidance warning for anything. No. I'm perfectly happy to have our 21st century product. Anyway, not things like churches that would say and stuff. They still have those. So back to ooids. The papers, the Trower papers also went, if ooids abrade regardless of size, there may be some other factor preventing net precipitation while grains are in motion. That is, lack of microbial biofilms, which could lend credence to the hypothesis that microbially-mediated ooid growth in quiet water environments is significant. So now we're already into the issue of tumultuous environments versus calm environments and the role of biofilms and what's doing what with what. So those papers that he was riffing off of did say that net abrasion for range of transport stages, but they suggested biofilms weren't, air quotes, required for formation at rest, and noting without a balancing precipitation, ooids decay in hours. So now the issues were moving to the issue of what's supplying the environment for calcification. And Oord got his leg into this argument from that 2018 paper, who found less growth in biofilm environments where the microorganisms were stabilizing conditions. And noting, quote, microbes appear to play a dominantly fabric destructive role, unquote, by which they meant fabric destruction through microbial microboring and micritization, unquote, that affected the grain size and form, concluding that speed of transport was still the driving factor. We're still way removed. Goldmark manufacturer tested in a CNS executive Thunderbird line out in 1956. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. That's so. I thought that would be the case. Yeah. My memory was so. I never had actually physically seen one of these cars, but I've seen videos and stuff on them and background material, because, you know, when you find out that somebody thought to put record players in a car, it was just like, Thunderbird would be Ford, and that would be in 56. That would still be the two-door if they were trying it in that. They didn't go to a four-door model until 1958. The 58 Thunderbird being Joe Oros's design that beat out Elwood Engel's little mini box, and is arguably the most influential car of the 20th century, because it launched the process of turning cars into vehicles that have bucket seats and center consoles up front. And that Thunderbird was one of the very first marketing things in the United States to do that, and gradually insinuated itself into the consciousness about what a personal luxury car was. And then when BMW started putting them on that arrangement on sedans, in little sports sedans in the 80s and that settled it to where by the 21st century, all passenger cars are laid out that way. And now trucks are laid out that way. Try finding a truck with a bench seat. They may still make them. I'm not sure. Anti-lock brakes either, never had them on my current pan. Well, depends on the way the anti-locks are designed and how they function. I know for a fact how nice it is on ice when you're not getting that, in the same way as traction control and stability control and all these other little features. But especially in some of the earlier design systems, and different companies may have had varying ranges on some of them, in the same way that we're just getting the teething pains of collision avoidance automatic braking systems, that some systems were working better than others, and so gradually they're working out better ways of doing it. My 90, your 90 still has bench seat. 1990s cars, that was still a common feature, that if you had sporty versions, they probably had some with bench seats or with the bucket seats. My 83 Buick Century T-Type had Learjet bucket seats up front, a center console. That was the very first car we ever had that had that arrangement. Digital instrument panel too. I didn't have a digital instrument panel again until the Hondas in the 2012, 2013 bits, by which time I'm in the hybrid era. I think 2004-ish was the last bench seat on a passenger car. I think it was a GM product that finally faded out. And people are so used to that arrangement. And you have to think about it, that the presence of bucket seat center consoles ubiquitously on all vehicles is changing the mating habits of people. You can't canoodle in the front seat of a car the way you theoretically could with so much space on a bench seat with nothing in between you and the other side of the car. That's not possible anymore. And so in the same way the railroad trains changed the breeding and the genetic background of people being able to marry people from 40, 50, 60, 100 miles away, and the transit, there were actually people that would have the 60-mile-an-hour club, they'd be doing that in the same way that people would have a big thrill to have sex on board an airplane flying at 400 miles an hour. That was altering the behavior of people in ways that we're never going to go back to, probably. Although in some respects, the increasing electronics and the elimination of conventional transmission systems, and that could theoretically permit very different interior layouts seats that you can rotate completely around because the car is self-driving. Things like that are potentially things that we may be seeing in the future. Anyway, back to ooids. We keep on flitting away from this. So the Anderson paper had taken note of that Trower work. So it's more recent stuff that is drawing on the previous work. And they're arguing that the role of microbes was unclear in spite of Trower's work, because the modern analogs differ regarding ocean chemistry, especially oxygenation. That contributes to carbonate precipitation. And large ooids of the type that we see in fossil context are not being produced either in laboratory constructions or in modern marine cases, which means that something different was going on in the past. And none of the paper's experiments or observation of current conditions were observing catastrophic settings or proposing that there needed to be any. And Anderson, in fact, was considering the role of underwater dune environments. So because conditions were so different in the past, well, let's look at the fossil record. And it's revealing that Oord skipped all the fossil information in his little short squib, but most of the papers, especially the ones that I'm citing, didn't skip that. From Batchelor to the Anderson one that Oord directly cited, so in principle he must have known about it. Batchelor compared various Mesozoic and Paleozoic ones to recognize that high velocity formation for them proposed back in the 1870s didn't match the facts or their modeling today. So the kind of, if you think about a catastrophic flood, high velocity being ruled out is having a problem for the flood. And because Batchelor was certainly mentioning this, you wonder why Oord didn't take note of it, because it was being brought up in the material that other people were dealing with. The Anderson paper correlated ooid growth in the fossil record with lower oxygen in the oceans in the Neoproterozoic times. And that means there's an awful lot of this stuff that's going on pre-Cambrian. That's terrible. And specified that low oxygen O2 frames were taking place during the Cambrian and Triassic and Jurassic exams where we're getting large ooids. So that seems to be the dynamic variable, not big slosh catastrophism. And the same processes are taking place in the pre-flood environment, since that's what Precambrian cartoon, and in the flood environment, in a way that isn't the case now because we have oxygen in the oceans. So, we'll find out. One thing that's interesting about following on these cases is to see if the ball gets dropped. And although you can have some obsessive bits, and Michael Oord can be pretty obsessive about banging the same drum over and over and over again, and you find the same thing with Hebert on Milankovitch cycles and Jerry Bergman on Darwinism and racism, and you get a whole bunch of things where they've got their little hobby horses. They're going to go on again and again and again. But it's often the case that the creationists will drop the little detail and never do anything with it again. So we'll find out whether or not that's the case with this one. I'm putting up also an older paper, Milroy and Wright, 2003, on Triassic English ooids from a lake context, and noting the varied areas of intershoal environment they propose for the bit of Triassic whales. And so all of that is entirely consistent with a naturalistic and non-catastrophic framework that happens to have low oxygen during certain little blips, and that's why these things occur. A brand new Metro crushed in an intersection, used insurance to get a new Saturn, which he rolled, then Ford probe demolished. Those were a few fun years. Yes, indeed. I don't really pine for the days of older automobiles. Modern cars are safer. They're more efficient. They have more creature comforts as standard equipment. The kinds of things that people are used to as like air conditioning and carpeting would have been luxury features and not at all standard equipment. Air conditioning wasn't a standard equipment on Cadillacs until I think the 1980s or 90s. So that shows you how the standards of things have changed as what we accept in automobiles. JSTOR is stable. Everybody take a look at that. We have such a wonderful little Bangalore of people knocking around. So the main upshot then is that Oord is the gift that keeps on giving. He's very prolific. He's been doing stuff for years and years and years and shows no sign of stopping. He's part of that narrow group that dominate the various creationist organizations. There's a small bunch of revolving door crowd between the Creation Research Society and the Institute for Creation Research and Creation Ministries International, which is the kissing cousin of Answers in Genesis, which is Ken Ham's little fiefdom. And there are various scientists that cross-fertilize and publish in these various venues. Others are much more proprietary and are basically pushing the party line of now Guliuza at ICR and Ken Ham's jihad against the new creationism, evolutionary creationism that's going on at AIG. But it's still a small bunch, and there's only about 40, 50 core fact claimants in the creationism field, and then another dozen over at Intelligent Design. So it's not a gigantic bunch, and that means it's not an impossible task of keeping track of a lot of them. What's funky about, I keep a listing of all the papers that are involved, all the scientists that have written them, and I put them into my spreadsheet, and I'm always just this glut of dozens and dozens of scientists cropping up every week that need to be added into the mix. If I find a new creationist now and then, particularly one that's not a grassroots one, but somebody that's kind of upper echelon, that's got some PhD clout or something to them, if there's a couple of those in a year, that's a busy year. In other words, there doesn't seem to be much in the way of growth going on in that. There's an awful lot of geriatrics in a lot of those groups. There are young generation creationists popping along, and once in a while you see them starting to make postings and that at ICR and AIG that I go, oh, there's a new author going on. Although sometimes even they aren't all that young. They've actually been kind of on training wheels for 15 or 20 years. And now they're given an opportunity to write a piece. So anyway, Purple, go ahead and check up on the show and later on it. Anyway, we'll see. It'll be funky to see what happens with automobiles in the remainder of the century as we move into a new era. The fact that you can disassemble the components so easily, that I'm expecting, not necessarily in the next 5 or 10 years, but beyond that, the conventional passive wheel connected to some kind of a transmission will be extinct, and wheels will contain the motor that drives them inside it, and therefore you need a power system to funnel energy to the wheels rather than having a separate powertrain. And so now you can open up the interior of the vehicle to have airflow across areas in a way that will allow some potentially really interesting and maybe weird looking designs, instead of just the big box that's an aerodynamic shell that covers over all the pieces. You can have things where the wheels are sticking out and air is flowing in around them to cool off the brakes and all of that, and cool off the battery systems and all that in ways that we don't do in modern cars and didn't do in any other until the older days, when one of the reasons why there were louvers and things on the big engines of the 1920s and 30s was because they generated an awful lot of heat. And even into the 40s and 50s and 60s, you had the need to be able to put a way of cooling it. And with old style cars that were cooled by water, had a conventional radiator, which cars still do to a great extent, there was an awful lot of difficulty in that. And cars today are way less prone. Think of the last time, if you were driving in a desert environment or going up the Grapevine into San Bernardino down in California, where you would see car stopped on the side of the road with its hood up because it had overheated. Those are relatively rare, and people that haven't maintained their cars very well. But they were common as hell when I was growing up. When we would drive up the Grapevine in the 1950s, there would be a line of Fords and General Motors cars up the line, and we're puddling up on our little 1956 Chrysler Plymouth zipping up the thing without any problems at all, because they were well engineered for that particular purpose. Chrysler later had a deterioration in quality and stuff in the next 20 years after that. But anyway, that shows you how different the products and things are. And I don't pine for all of that at all. I love the fact that I got a climate controlled air conditioning in the car. I love the fact that the seats are so incredibly comfortable. I love the fact that I have safety features and the visibility of things, and the tinted windows that are structured in such a way that I'm not having glare, and the stiffer steering and braking, and allows me to keep better control of the car in icky weather. I mean, all of that's just spectacular. And I'm anticipating that cars, as we move farther into the century, will maintain an awful lot of that stuff. So we're used to having 0 to 60 times on cars that would just blow away people's sensibilities 50 years ago. My God, you think, a standard sedan, boring, minivan, passenger car type vehicle that can go 0 to 60 in 10 seconds? That's damn fast by sports car standards back 50 years ago. Nowadays, it's considered boring and slow, and real sports cars, or even gigantic Bentleys, that can go 0 to 60 in 3.5 seconds. Wow. So we're in a different world. So anyway, put the battery in what the aisle is now. Yeah, there's and that will be another thing that we'll be seeing again in cars, is flat floors. Flat floors used to be the case in old automobiles prior to World War II. And that ended as the body was pulled down into the chassis to make them lower, and that put the transmission hump, which if anybody from my age will know that vivid transmission hump. That also began to disappear when cars switched to front-wheel drive. So they didn't have a transmission running down the middle of the car to the rear wheels, and therefore that transmission hump ceased to be a problem, and you could put a console in or something like that. Pull the safety stuff of his Tesla. It doesn't get traction. That's my current truck gets 4.6 miles per gallon. The car gets 32. Heat shield, my Honda Civic Hybrid gets 45 miles per gallon all the time. City and highway driving. In really good weather, it can even get up into the 50s range. And so I could drive on a 13-gallon tank from here to Portland, which is 420 miles, and have gas left over. First car I've ever had that could do that. So I do not pine for any of that. And I do feel, however, for everybody with older style trucks and all that, that when I was still in the working environment, when we had $4 a gallon gas during some of the Obama years occasionally, my gosh, the ones with the Suburbans were having hemorrhages when they had to go to fill up, because it was just a big gas tank and a heck of a lot of money to spend on it. That was very dismal for them. When the price of gas blips up, we have quite expensive gas here in Washington State. And it's running around $5 a gallon, which and we have fairly high gas taxes in that as well. So we can build more freeways over in Seattle. But anyway, I just ration, so I don't do an enormous amount of driving. So I put in 3 gallons, $15, and that tides me over for another month. I wouldn't have been able to do that in the old car that I had, the old Zolero, that got half as good a gas mileage around town. So I would have had to have put in, and even though it had a slightly bigger tank, 15 gallons, that didn't compensate for the fact that the hybrid is so radically efficient. And the newer hybrids even yet are pushing up into the 50 some odd mile range. I mean, my God, they're the newer Priuses and all the rest. And so it changes the dynamic, even without going into a full electric plug-in environment, which someday, hopefully, I'll be able to get into that range, A, when I can afford it, and B, when the infrastructure has switched up to the point where there's no distance anxiety. The battery technology is already reaching the stage when you can put on a passenger car or truck a battery system that will give you a 300-mile range, which is enough to get from Spokane to Seattle on a charge. And that eventually will filter down through all the different grades of vehicles as the competitive environment works up and improved battery technology and all that. So anyway, that's yet more little side lights. We're coming up on the full hour. It's should have kept an endurance on 2 trucks was getting bad. Yeah. Well, that was another feature of getting the new car, is that the new vehicles insurance was less per month than the insurance on the old car, because the new Honda had so many more safety features on it that it just got better insurance levels on it. And so that's another factor to consider on it. So I'm happy with doing videos on my magic computer device and being able to download PDFs from the interweb in a matter of seconds, and storing information and writing things and studying things to criticize creationists, and being able to print books up, fiction and nonfiction. And eventually I'll even do the same thing with my politique game. It'll be a while before I'll be able to scrape up enough money to get the test pieces to be able to do some test playing around with game clubs. And there's also a bunch over in Seattle, Tacoma area, where they have like yearly conventions and all of that. I'll want to be able to schlep the thing around there, but I will definitely do the rules as a book in that same size. The booklet will be about 60 pages that will allow me to copyright the rules and do it up with a nice professional look with all color and all that kind of stuff. So that's for the future, a couple years down the road, we'll see. Anyway, everybody that wants to have 88.5 or 53 miles again, the math coming back from Colorado. Yeah, if there's certain circumstances when you can get really good. The old, typically a 4-cylinder engine has easily can generate a 35 or better gas mileage out on the highway, and 25-ish or better around town, depending upon how much of a lead fit you were. And I have to admit that now, with the efficiency rating modules and stuff, that I can see what the engine is doing, I tend to be less of a lead foot in the Civic hybrid than I was with the Alero. But being able to have auto stop, which shuts the engine down when you're at stoplights or going through a drive-through, I would stop and park and go in because I didn't want to spend the gas sitting there burning it while I was waiting for my tacos. But now it's not a problem because the car's in auto stop, shuts down, and then whoop, instantly turns back on when I have to pull forward. That's a totally different technology. And the regenerative braking, which means all the times I've gone down hills losing that energy that I'm braking with, that instead that can be pumped into the power system. That's how you convert an engine that can do 25 miles around town to one that can do 45 miles per around town, because you're not wasting gas going nowhere. The engine disables and deactivates until you need it again. It can turn on instantaneously and all that. So that hybrid technology is really delicious. And I can't imagine why anybody who gets one doesn't want to keep that, or go even better eventually with the full electric mode. You need to have one at some point. Yeah, my mother had a tremendous prejudice against foreign cars and Japanese cars in particular. And I think she would probably be absolutely rolling over in the grave to know that I have a Honda. She was, her family was all Chrysler products all the way. And it was quite a shock to be able to nudge her over to a Buick, the first General Motors car she ever bought, and a 6-cylinder engine to boot, to show you how times had changed. When she grew up, she was born in 1910. And so we're talking about her maturity in the 40s and 50s and 60s, that a 6-cylinder engine was just useless, that it had no pep, as my mother would put it. You needed an 8-cylinder engine to get enough power to be able to pull a car up. If you were driving as a single, widowed mother, hauling the stupid, noisy kids behind you on a 2-lane road up through Shasta, and you have to get around a line of trucks in a hurry, you don't want to have a wussy little 1950s 6-cylinder engine in your car. But so it was a shock when she discovered by the 1980s what 6-cylinder engines could do. And then that was before fuel injection changed it even more. And then the further shock was the discovery of what a 4-cylinder engine could do with fuel injection, multi-port and all that. So the little Oldschiva that we in the family had in the 1990s, 92, I think it was the model year, that had a quad engine that could blow the socks off of any previous car engine that we had driven. And to show you again how the technology had changed, I mentioned the Grapevine, which is a very steep hill in California that it doesn't wind along a lot, but it goes up fairly steeply. There's a counterpart to that going from Spokane to Seattle, and it's Advantage, where you go down into the trough of the Columbia River, and then you go up and up and up and up, and that bloody hill seems to go on forever. You keep on seeing more road, and then you turn around the hill and there's more road, and it just is going up and up and up. It's a very long hill. And none of the cars that I had had up until that Achieva could go up the Vantage Hill on cruise control. It's easy peasy with modern cars. Because they have that computer control, multi-port fuel injection, and all that. And so the efficiency that's going on is just a totally different environment. So I don't get even slightly nostalgic for older vehicles. The seats were uncomfortable. They were unsafe and difficult to drive, and everything about them. No, I'll take a modern car any day. So Pasadena Pass, San Marcos Pass, California can kill a weak car. Yeah, that's there's an awful lot of weird thing. And the other feature has to do with road handling. Someone pointed out that back in the 80s, when they noted that in people pining for the great days of the giant Duesenberg supercharged luxury vehicles with their powerful engines and all that, and you could get a hell of a lot of horsepower, 400 or 500 horsepower out of those supercharged engines, V16s and things like that. Notice how many cylinders you needed for that. But they pointed out how absolutely ghastly they were when it came to handling. And they pointed out that if you had a road race between a Duesenberg SJ and a BMW 3 Series up the windy little roads up the coast of California up to Monterey, that BMW would leave that Duesenberg in the dust instantly, because it could never handle those curves at speed in a way that little BMW that feels like it's glued to the road could do. And now it's reached the stage that virtually all regular passenger cars will have handling characteristics that's not dissimilar to the handling characteristics of those old BMWs. That's become ubiquitous as handling features of cars. Much stiffer steering, better brakes, greater road stability. Everything about it is just a different world. So anyway, I keep on rambling on. Everybody remember that there is oh, yes, matter of fact, I should be loading up for my blurb for the old book. Come on here. Let's see if I can get the thing structured here. Old RJ has to go through and click on the little windows. There we go. Okay, let's give that a try. I think it's hopefully doing its thing. Wonderful Peter's little advert for the book. Links to Rochford Air and Evolution Slam Dunk and both of the Paralogs novels are available, as well as a link to Patreon for those who feel that there's a little teeny scratch, a couple bucks a month maybe, that's burning a hole in the pocket where you figure, hey, let's put it to RJ so that he's got a little more connecting up to make sure that he can make life miserable for creationists even longer and even better. Jackson and I are terribly proud of the book. I think it's improved both of our writing and research ends of things. Volume 2 will easily be as massive, and we have other books in the works, so we are definitely going to be busy little beavers. Okay, that's the end of that. And everybody, spread the word on the channel. Say RJ's got a better internet connection, so maybe you can catch a look of it. And BC can be a task for a lemon. And welcome to the 21st century. And if we can survive it, we're going to make it, okay? But without any wooden penguins. So see you all next week. And everybody stay cool and try to avoid floods and disasters and fires and all the other crap that's going on, let alone cluster bombs in Ukraine. So bye.